In this episode, I get to talk with Ernest Ko, the CEO of Proof+Geist, and we focus on the Mizu theme. Now, this is a theme that Proof+Geist created, which you can use in your own FileMaker apps. Join us as we talk about creating the theme, using the theme, and how it has an impact on design with a capital D. I presented at the Atlanta user group recently, the Atlanta FileMaker user group, and I was focused on UI UX, and Mizu is something I brought up. So we were focused on UI and themes in FileMaker. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Mizu is? Can you tell everyone what it is?
Yeah, so from my perspective, Mizu is an internal theme that we made to make it easy for us to build new FileMaker apps, right? So there are a lot of themes in FileMaker. There's some pretty good ones, and what we needed though was something a little different. So we built Mizu.
And how long have you been working on this theme?
Off and on, probably a couple of years.
Okay, all right. And who's been working on it? Is it mostly you?
Me, Corn, bunch of other
Nice.
people, lots of testers. You,
I did get my hands in it.
yes, you did.
Very cool. All right, so why create a theme in FileMaker? What was the reason behind it?
Well, I mean, I think that uh, that's a good question. Why create a new theme? There's almost no reason to create a new theme in FileMaker. You should just use whatever's there. Until it doesn't work for you, then you have to go scramble. So I think that was the place that we were in. The themes that come with FileMaker are actually pretty good. The universal, minimalist, some of the modern themes that are in 19 and 18 and so forth. Those are pretty good. What I needed though was a theme that worked within our design system, right? And we had a way of thinking about how you build FileMaker applications, and we needed a theme that sort of matched that workflow. So that's really the primary reason. It's not to replace all the components. It's not really about the look and feel, although the look and feel is pretty good.
Sure.
It's really about sort of the design process, if you will.
Got it. Okay. So when we talk about a FileMaker theme, there's a lot of components that go into building it, right? There's
Yeah.
creating a new theme itself. There's every style that goes with that for every different type of object. Then you've got different states, hover states, and whatnot. I'm guessing it was a pretty big endeavor to get this done, right?
Getting started was really easy. Getting it
Okay,
right was really, really hard
got it.
because there's just so many little details. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
all the different states, and it's not always discoverable. So, like, you don't really know sometimes whether it's right until you use it. So, I think more than anything else, it's sort of repetition and iteration and time, and actually being able to apply it to an actual use case, so that it's not theoretical. Um, yeah, I mean, there are other ways to do this. I mean, I know some people take existing themes and, you know, try to hack it with XML and all that, but that wasn't our approach. So it probably took a little longer than it needed to be.
got it. Okay. Now you talked about Mizu fitting into the design thinking that you have in mind. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So the key thing about Mizu is that it's really about trying to minimize the amount of pixel pushing you have to do to design a nice looking and good flowing file mechanic. Right. So for us, we're talking about design more broadly, so not strictly about the specific um, look and feel of every single component, but more about how the application works and how it interacts with the user. So
Design capital
often,
D, right?
yeah, design capital D, exactly. So it's really more about UX than UI specifically, although there's quite a bit of UI in that. You can't escape that entirely, right? It has to
Right.
look good. It has to have some minimum standard, but it's fundamentally about design capital D. And by that, what I mean is when we go about building an application, we take the approach of having fairly lightweight um, iterative loops in the process of visualizing what you want to do and then implementing it and getting feedback and rinsing and repeating that whole process over and over. So often what we want to do is to take a lo-fi design, a low fidelity design, basically, you know, Sharpie pens and paper and big squiggly lines and that sort of thing, and present it to the user and get some testing, get some feedback, and then kind of increase the level of fidelity from that point. So what the theme has to do is to afford developers a sort of a very lightweight way of getting things on the layout. So what you don't want to do is figure out, exactly where the pixels need to be for this object. You don't want to spend time tweaking the fonts. You don't want to spend time doing any of that. What you want to do is just drag ready-to-use components on a screen, put it in major sections of the screen, and kind of drill down that way. So it starts very loose, and then it gets tighter as your design tightens up.
Got it.
So that's the basic outline. So with Mizu, a lot of the emphasis is around the grid, right? So it really doesn't work unless you design around the grid. I know you and I have talked about the grid for many years. And did I bring you around to the grid?
I was thinking about this, that it was DevCon in Dallas.
It was a Smurf DevCon, right?
The what? Yes, it was the Smurf DevCon.
That's
right. It was also the DevCon that was a little traumatic because I lost to Corn Walker at Cornhole.
At Cornhole, that's right.
And you delivered some Cheetos on his behalf for my loss.
I did.
But I remember that I had specifically reached out to you because I wanted to talk about grids. And I think somewhere I still have a little note card that has a grid on it that you explained to me. But tell me a little bit about grids. So let's talk about, let's do the quick version of why grids matter and why Mizu is so focused on it.
Well, I think it's about repeatability, and it's about having a framework and guideline that you can use to frame objects on the layout without thinking too hard about positioning, right? And that reduces so much cognitive lift. And then you're making decisions about more important things and not just how you would nudge an object here or there or where it fits relative to other objects. And spacing becomes just natural. Basically the whole layout becomes naturally space for you without having to think about it. But that's my take. I mean, so with FileMaker layouts, it's really about constraints. When you open up a blank layout, your app can be 1296, 1280, 1024, 765, whatever you choose, you can make the app do whatever it wants to be, right? So where do you start? I think that's the problem, right? So what we want to say is start here, and then spend time worrying about the actual details of what the user wants to do, and not so much about how big things are, where things need to flow, where things need to fit.
I just implemented Mizu for one project that we had a chance to start from a new file, which is a huge benefit when it comes to theming and worrying about grids and things like that. And I will say that it definitely removed a lot of friction for me.
Say more about that though, because
So, when I set up the grid, it took a little bit because again, I hadn't yet settled on the size of the screen. But once I settled on that, I set up my grid. I was ready to go, and I really didn't have to think much because everything snaps to the grid. What's interesting is that, like you said, it's about constraints. And so sometimes I would have too many things I wanted to put on a layout, or too many, usually it was just objects or fields. And it actually made me think more practically about what I was putting on the layout and whether it had to be there, versus in past FileMaker lives, I've just kind of thrown stuff where it belongs, right? I mean, we probably have all done this where we just throw a checkbox where it fits. But being a little more mindful, even though it's the friction to just throw stuff on the layout is less, it also makes you more mindful of what you're putting on the layout to make sure that it belongs and that it's in the right place on the screen, things like that.
Right.
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, it definitely helped me out. I think grids are a little bit tricky in FileMaker because your objects have to be sized properly. So one of the things that the theme can't control is the height of a text box, for example, right? I have to choose that myself. And so I think that was where, I drag a field and it's, 12 pixels tall, and I'm like, no, I need you to be divisible by 8. But once you fix that, it really does flow much, much better.
Yeah, one of the things with Mizu is that the horizontal, the vertical height matters, but it matters more for consistency than it does for placement. I mean, it's very much horizontally kind of fixed more than it is vertically fixed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
But it has some really nice things though. I mean, one of the things that we spent quite a bit of time on is if you take an object in Mizu, a component like a field or a text label, and you try to minimize the height of that object, it will snap to its base set height out of the box for you. So you don't have to think about how large your field is. You just drag it, and if you are sort of confused as to whether it needs to be 36 or 32 or whatever, you just drag it as minimum size, and it will be set correctly out of the
Yeah.
box. Now you can change it to whatever you want, but that's a easy shorthand to to make it kind of effortless in
Nice.
placement. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the places where I really appreciated having Mizu was around text and having headers and subheaders, titles, subtitles, all those things that are so common. And when you look at something like Markdown, this is very, very standard, right?
Yep.
And again, in FileMaker, that's not a constraint that we traditionally have. But putting that constraint on my design work was so helpful because I knew that my titles were this, and I was
Right.
always going to put it in this one spot. So consistency was much, much easier.
Yeah, that's very hard to do if you don't have those constraints, right? Because then you don't remember what your title was when you set it 5 layouts ago.
Right.
And you just make an adjustment you think is right, and you go back and you say, well, so I need to redo all my titles, all my subtitles, just to harmonize it. And then once you do that, you got to reflow your layout because everything's shifted, right? So it's one of those things where this is hard. That there's kind of no way around it. It's much better if you start with those constraints and those basic style elements than not, because going back to fix it is pretty darn expensive in FileMaker.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about undifferentiated work, right? And
Hmm.
that's what we were trying to avoid here.
That's
Now,
right.
that said, if I play devil's advocate for a second, should I be putting Mizu on every file? Does that make it boring because now every file looks like Mizu? Is that okay?
Well, what I like to say is that it's a starting point, right? I mean, if it's a place where you begin so that you can invest time in really differentiating the application in a way that makes sense. So, I mean, it's agnostic about color, it's agnostic about a lot of things, right? The starting point gives you a basic palette that works. But hey, if you want to tweak it and make your buttons fall within a certain palette range, by all means. It's a pretty white theme. I think there's a dark mode, but it's not really fully implemented.
Hmm.
So it's not about setting limits. It's really about setting the frame in which you should start a design.
Got it. Got it. Well, and on top of that, I will say that it was helpful that the file, the Mizu file where the theme is, also comes with guidelines and explanations. So it's not just here's a theme and good luck figuring
Right.
out what an H2 is or what the subtitle is. That everything really does have its place and is pretty well explained. I think that's a game changer, right? When documentation is there to support the thinking behind it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that it's also fairly constrained. I mean, I think there's a way to do this where every single component that you possibly need is kind of pre-built for you, and you're dragging, you know, all the widgets that you want from pre-built groups of objects from a layout that has been defined for you. That is not Mizu. Mizu is a much more low-level theme, right? It's really here's some basic components, uh, but what it does come with is um, a sort of guide to a general sense of how things should look and
Mm,
how things should be. So we talk about having cards to kind of mimic sort of the grouping of objects and the component groups, and we talk about we'll show you where fields and titles and labels should go, and those are just good starting points, right? But that is like 60-75% of what most people need, and so I think it works pretty well.
yeah, yeah. And I added some stuff when I implemented it for our client project. I definitely added things as I needed them, right? There are certain things that aren't there, like you said, out of the box, but it's a great starting point. And I was able to copy elements, make small tweaks, but my guidelines were really good, right? So
Right.
my constraints felt really, really tight, and I didn't feel like I was flailing trying to figure out what color should it be or does this match with all the other stuff I've got. So how does it fit with the idea of modern FileMaker? We've talked a lot about this recently. We talk about it internally, we talk about it externally.
Hmm.
How does Mizu benefit this modern FileMaker? How does it tie to that?
Design's foundational to this whole modern FileMaker concept that we've been talking. Um, and again, by design, we're talking about design capital D, right? So all modern FileMaker apps, we believe, need to be designed. And it doesn't mean that it needs to go through a very, very deep design evolution. What it does mean is that it needs to be intentional, right? So we need to ask the right questions. What problems are we trying to solve? Who the users are, what their scenarios are, what their goals are, and really try to articulate a design expression that fits those questions, that answers those questions. So Mizu is simply the visual palette that allows us to quickly um, do away with being too focused on pixels and lines and all the minutiae of design and really focus on the larger questions of design, which is what should this thing actually do, right? So for us, it's very important to not waste time on like arguing about font size, arguing about, you know, how big the field should look, what the standard dimension should be, whether or not how do you express a tab interface, what do you do with slide panels and all this stuff. To me, that's all undifferentiated, right? So those things should be just basic practice that we can accept and just run with. And all the time that we want to spend on design, most of that should go towards asking good questions and testing and getting feedback. So that's what Mizu does. So it's really a lightweight way of putting things on a screen, and then that has a pathway for making it look really, really good. Right. So often you can start with a basic theme like minimalist and so forth, and that's fine, but it doesn't really scale up well beyond the basic stuff, right?
Yeah.
And what you want is something a little bit better than that from a visual standpoint, but yet doesn't constrain you and gives you a way of expressing much more than you already have.
Yeah.
The other thing is it's part of a modern design system, and it actually takes its cue from two design systems: the IBM Carbon design system and the Google's Material system. So all the things that people have put a lot of thought into, how big things ought to be, how far things ought to be, how should layers work, how should you visually signal, dimensions and depth and all that stuff. All that stuff is taken care of for you, so you don't worry about that level of detail. That's really important stuff, right? That's the visual element that gives design depth, meaning, and the right cues to the user. Uh, so the basic components of those things are already expressed in Mizu.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's modern in both of those senses.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a previous episode I talked about not liking bespoke security, and I think that there's something about bespoke spending too much time on bespoke design, and not to say that design shouldn't be unique, right? There's an art to it, and some people are excited about that, some aren't. But there is an expectation that comes from web design and its current format, and it's nice to follow those. I know that when I've implemented Mizu, it looks right. It looks familiar, it looks acceptable, right? Like there's no shock factor when you look at it. Like it doesn't look dated, it
Right.
doesn't look inconsistent. It actually brings comfort in knowing that I've seen this before, right? It's a very common palette.
Yeah. I mean, I think design should be unique, but we often confuse you we often confuse like uniqueness of every single visual element from the uniqueness of the actual experience, right? So it has to be unique, but what you don't want to do is kind of reinvent every single design decision that gives you your palette to make a unique experience. It's kind of like nobody argues about what color red is or what the hue is. If you have a hex number, that is that color,
Yeah.
right? We're not going back to first principles on define blue or define line weight.
Right.
So that's a very primitive way of thinking about it, but you can extrapolate from that. So what we want is basically a toolbox with Lego bricks, of different sizes and different shapes to use, and not just start with um, you know atoms and chemicals, and so you have to mix everything from scratch and build things, right? So that's what Mizu fundamentally is about.
such a great way of thinking about it. And I remember FileMaker without themes, which was difficult because everything was completely custom, right? You'd copy and paste in hopes of using similar styles, but it was tougher because there wasn't this style and theme idea. And so already we've been given the ability to make Lego pieces, but now Mizu's just giving us the a standard set of Lego pieces.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think it's about consistency, right? It's about not having to manually manage, um, you know, getting consistent with your design surface. Again, you can already do this with existing themes. I mean, I think if you are starting in FileMaker, or I would really encourage people look to the existing themes that are there. Minimalist and Universal Touch, and those are pretty decent. Even Apex Blue. I mean, those are decent starting points. Right? I think the key here is that Mizu isn't trying to replace those. It's not. It's like, in fact, I don't think you could take an existing theme and just apply Mizu and make it just work out of the box. Please don't do that. It's not designed for for that
Right.
kind of work. It's not like a theme forest concept where you just say, yeah, I want to pick a whole new theme set and
Right.
boom, my whole website just changes. It's not
Right.
that at all. It's specifically about teaching or providing guidelines for working within the Proof+Geist design system.
When I first implemented Mizu, I was a little nervous, and I felt like this a few times now. But one of the thing that made me nervous was I felt like I had lost control of the design, right? Because I was using this, this not out of the box, but this Mizu box was provided for me, and like, does that mean I don't get to be creative? Does it mean I don't get to do the fun stuff? Because I love design, right? Like it's exciting for me. Um, but I was once I let go of that a little bit, and let go of my control issues, it was fascinating how much more fun it was actually to do the work because I was so focused on the UX, right? So like the UI pieces were there. I made a couple of tweaks where I wanted to. I created a couple of styles where I needed them, but I didn't have to think about all that stuff. The mental load was
Yeah.
so much lighter. And so one of the places where I implemented it, where I had to make my own little tweaks, we had we used Digital Fusion's Elemental to do multiple
Mm,
file drag and drop.
yeah, I love that thing.
And so the UX thing I was trying to solve was how do you drag and drop those files and then interact with those files, because you might need to add a comment or change the file name, whatever the FileMaker side file name is. Um, and so I just went online and like Googled how other people do this. And then I picked one that looked familiar. But I had all the components, like Mizu provided all those things for me. So I just had to put them in the right place on a layout. But it was so much more fun to focus on what that interaction was like instead of
Right.
focusing on what that object was.
I'm so happy to hear that, because I think that's the entire intent.
Oh,
And I think
good.
you're an interesting. I mean, this is an interesting use case, right? Because we sort of said, "Hey, Martha, welcome. Here's Mizu. Good luck." you know, and, and I'm kind of curious how what from your experience what that was actually like. What was the learning curve, if you will? I guess here's my question.
Sure.
Um, Obviously, we have new people joining us all the time with affiliates at Proof that need to learn the system. What is your advice in sort of working with Mizu and with the Proof design system?
I think that when I was onboarded and I looked at Mizu, it was pretty and it looked well thought through and it looked like it was ready for something. But I didn't really know, I hadn't seen it in practice at that time. And so I was missing that. Like, this sounds cool in this space that's been curated for it, but what does this
Mhm.
look like in the wild? And so there was a little bit of a learning curve to do that, to get it from the ideal to to in practice. But once I embraced the grid and once I just allowed the elements to be what they were, and let myself be constrained, it was totally commonsensical. I mean, it just felt so much easier. And just like in any other FileMaker solution, I'm still copying layouts, right, to ease the
Mhm.
development effort. And so so it's not like I lost any of that, right? It's not like I have to drag everything on a new layout or anything. But my consistency just felt so much better. I knew what
Mhm.
objects I was using. I didn't let myself create a new style for every little thing that popped in my brain. So I think as I hope that as people start using Mizu out in the FileMaker world, I hope that people will show how they actually implement it, because I think there's value in seeing it in the wild. Um, and I remember showing that client file to somebody, and they were like, "It just looks so clean." And I was like, "I know," and I am not responsible for that. It's just this is what the theme did for me, right? It just made it that much
Right.
easier for that to happen. So I think some of that in the wild is what I want. I love seeing things in practical use.
That's
Concepts are
good.
fun to talk about and think about, but the in practice is what I'm always looking for.
That's good.
Yeah, I think like I said, I'm a huge fan of it, and to your point, it's not the end all be all. It doesn't mean that all the other themes are wrong or shouldn't be used. I liked it for its simplicity and for its familiarity when I looked at it.
Hmm.
So, do you think? What's your thought? Does that align with what you were hoping for from an onboarding? Did I break the matrix?
I think it's exactly right. I mean, I think Miso was born out of um, this sense that we were reinventing this wheel
Got
over
it.
and over again. And it's not that we were reinventing the style wheel, because there were plenty of styles to choose from. But what we were reinventing is sort of the design process, right? There was no consistent way of saying, um, this is where we start, this is how we think about the problem, and this is how we generally express it on a layout, right? So I think it's really about getting to some kind of scaling factor for that sort of work.
Yeah,
Um, and I think we're still implementing it. So I mean, I think we're still very much in this space where we have lots of different themes that we've inherited, lots of different styles that we've inherited, and we're still very much tempted to make our own new style every time we think of something that pops into our heads.
absolutely. You talk about inherited systems. Is there something we can glean from Mizu for inherited systems where it's got 150 layouts, and they're not ready to do a new redesign on it?
Yeah, that's pretty challenging. I mean, I think that it's going to be difficult to kind of restyle the theme, no matter what style or what theme that you have, right, from an inherited system, because things just don't fit right. You can have to resize a bunch of different things. You may have to
Yeah,
reflow things, and sometimes the contrast is just wrong because different objects have custom styles and all that kind of thing. Um, my advice, because we have a lot of that stuff too with older legacy products and so forth. But first, you want to get out of classic. So whatever you can do, take a classic layout and just make it a non-classic layout. Redo it,
yeah,
implement it in a new theme, because that's from a performance standpoint, that's going to be so much better.
right.
But B, try to minimize the number of extraneous things that are on that layout, right? So stacked objects, kind of goofy things that you have to do to make something look good in the past, shadows and all that stuff. Try to just reduce the weight of the layout to basic components. I think those are the two starting points. A good way to do this is just to take something like minimalist or universal and just apply it and see what happens. So all
Mm,
kinds of things are going to break. Right? You can say, well, this button just doesn't work, and now you have a checklist of things that you have to go and kind of fix before you reapply, so that you have a starting point to make it look good.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that was actually the exercise that we took with Mizu, because we had to take existing old system and kind of make it sort of work with Mizu, but not totally work enough. I mean, enough to a point where we felt like we had a way to convert legacy systems, with some with a heuristic, if you will, with a set of rules or steps.
Got it. I think that another suggestion that I have is that if you have an existing, so if you've got something that you've
Hmm.
inherited, um, if you have the chance to work with Mizu either in its sandbox or whether you put it into your own in some new solution, if you start to understand the why behind it, you can then look at your existing solution and say, how can I modify little things to start applying these habits, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
maybe you
right.
can't do a bulk change, but let's talk about what a title looks like, or let's talk about what standards we should be setting or where we should be aligning things.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also, um, so so decoupling it a little bit. My favorite word for 2021 and 2022.
It's true.
Uh,
I've heard it just like once or twice, but go
Once or
ahead.
twice, yes. In fact, I was just looking at a video from the first Engage, and I
Uh-huh.
said that word. Oh my god, it goes back so far. Um, but what I mean is that if you can implement Mizu in a new component, um, and integrate it that way, that's an easy way to bring a new theme in without kind of rewriting the whole thing. I think philosophically, that's also pretty important to us, right? I mean, I think we have a tendency to want to redo everything, just so that things fit and look good and is stylistically consistent. And I think there's a place for that. But the problem is if you don't start somewhere and you don't have a basis to iterate forward with, you don't get anywhere. So a lot of a lot of this is about what small thing can we change, and if we can't make an existing layout do exactly what we want to do, can we do it somewhere else? Yeah.
Right. Right. I worked on a project with Claris a while back now, but we worked with a designer on their team, and now that I'm reflecting on it, it's this idea of constraint and starting somewhere that really got us through that project. We had tried to design the theme ourselves for this file we were creating,
Mm.
and we just went overboard. I mean, we tried to think of every scenario that could ever be covered in any solution, left aligned, right aligned, centered. Everything was triplicated at least. And it was so exhausting. And so when we went to the designer, she was like, "No, we don't need a lot of this. Like, let's start with the basics." And in good design with a capital D format, we iterated on it, right? So we started with something, we started to implement it, and we'd reach out to her and say, "Hey, look, we've got this new thing we need to solve for. What would you recommend?" And she'd come in and say, either use this existing stuff, or here are some ways we can think through it. And maybe we do need a new style or whatever it was. But it was a really interesting exercise, and it was a challenge. But it definitely helped. It probably helped me embrace Mizu better because I had that experience of having constraints already.
Yeah, I think even the name Mizu is somewhat intentional, right? It's you have to go. Mizu stands for, I guess, water or blue. You know, it's about going with the flow, right? It's
Mm,
kind of a Zen perspective on
yeah,
design, which is don't fight it so much. Keep it simple
yeah.
and really live within constraints. Um, that's a hard thing to do, but it's fundamentally about saying no.
Oh no! Wait a minute. I wasn't ready for that turn in the conversation. All right, fine. I will allow it. I will allow it. I'm embracing it slowly but surely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's good stuff. Yeah, I think the switch. I think it is so easy to get stuck on design with a lowercase d and just being focused on objects on a layout. And I hear developers say it all the time that they don't care about the design piece, right? That's not what they want to focus on. They care about the scripts. They care about the calcs. They care about the integrations or whatever. But fundamentally, it's design with a capital D that matters, right? It's just there's a little bit of that lowercase that we've got to do, but Mizu hopefully, removes some of that pressure of having to get design lowercase, and being able to focus on the UX and what the experience needs, right? Because if it's not a used feature, then it's not, it's like the tree that falls in the forest if no one hears it. So
That's more Zen. Right on. I think that design with a lowercase d is absolutely important, but it's also a commodity, right?
mm,
Um, and they're very very smart people who've spent a lot of time, and very creative people who spent a lot of time refining the lowercase design elements, and we should just use it. Right?
yeah,
We can
that sounds
reinvent that
right.
stuff, and that's very cool. I'd love to do that. I remember the days when we were building icons one pixel at a
Oh
time.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And then you got to
I do
decide
not
which
miss
ones are
that.
which buttons are clickable. You know, like I'm saying,
Oh
like yeah, that was so wrong. Why did we do that? Right? I mean,
yeah,
so I think Mizu is an expression of exactly that idea. Not that idea, but the idea that yeah, that's not what we want to do. We want to focus on capital D design, not because lowercase d design is unimportant. It's just that it should be done already.
yeah,
It should
yeah.
be ready to go. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know about the way that you work on 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 FileMaker systems and the way that you've built out stuff, especially around UX. But I borrow from the internet all the time, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's funny that I've got some constraints in some places and I want to be creative in others. But at the end of the day, the path to success is to do the thing that people expect. And so it's my job to ask the right questions and to make sure that I understand where they're trying to go. But like the multi-file picker thing, right? Like I could invent that all over again, but I'll probably get it wrong. So let me go see what the internet's done or what the web, what good trusted websites are doing and see if I can implement some of that back into FileMaker.
I think that's right. I think it's more important to understand the user scenarios that are in question, and then to find patterns that fit and iterate from that perspective, than to settle on one idea, one pattern, and be very precious about it from the get-go because you've invested so much design into this, right? I mean, you're not going to change that thing that you just implemented, or you don't want to, because psychologically you're wedded to that
Right.
60,000 hours you put into making that button do exactly that click experience, right? We've all
Yep.
done that, right? So, but I think that's exactly right. So this idea that you can go out, find something that people are already using, borrow a pattern, look at 3 different versions of that and see what happens. That's the kind of flow that we're trying to encourage. And we want to encourage that in FileMaker with native components or with existing components. So the idea is that if you're going to build something and prototype something in FileMaker, let's afford devs to do that very quickly. So if I have to build 3 different versions of your picker, I want that experience to be very fluid and easy, and not heavy, and fundamentally so that I can throw it away. Right? I can say,
Yeah.
no, I'm going to do it all over again.
Right.
Right.
That's awesome. I like that. All right. So back to focusing on Mizu for a second. Is this something that people can get? Where does it live?
It lives on GitHub. And I think if you go to Proof+Geist GitHub account page, it's Proof+Geist at github.com, and you just look for Mizu, it should show up.
Okay, perfect. And I think we're going to put it in the marketplace too, right? Hopefully.
Yeah, as soon as they approve it, it should be in the marketplace.
Iterations of Mizu? I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. New
It's
stuff.
not bug-free. There are obviously issues.
Okay.
But that's the way it rolls, and we'll just keep updating it as we see it.
Cool. All right, awesome. And I mentioned earlier I like practical, so hopefully we can create some YouTube videos about and actually show off Mizu and talk about it a little bit more. So differentiate between little d and big D design, but it'll be good to see it in practice, right?
Yes, I like that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ernest. It's always fun to talk about design. I know you and I tend to geek out about this stuff, so thanks for teaching me grids many years ago, and now both forcing me and making me love grids because it really did make things easier. So
I'm glad you came
nice
around.
about it.
The world is a much better place.
It is a little bit brighter. Awesome.
All right, Martha. Thank you.
Thanks, Ernest.
Good chatting.
All right,
Bye-bye.
yep. Just as a reminder, this is available on YouTube and as a podcast, and make sure you check out the show notes as there are a lot of links to share there. If you can take a minute to pause and subscribe, we'd really appreciate it, but better yet, if you can share it with a friend, that would be pretty awesome. No matter what your role is in this community, you're proof of how amazing this Claris community really is. My job is to help spread your knowledge and your stories on the podcast. Find me on Twitter at MZ123 or at Proof+Geist, and let's share your story.